First, I just want to thank a couple people for allowing me to be here today. The first is Swapnendu Mohanty, the Chief FinTech Officer of the Monetary Authority. I want to thank him, and I also want to praise him for having the courage to allow me to give a talk entitled "Technology is Dead" at a FinTech conference. I also want to recognize Chris Kanakaratne, who is the CEO of Virtusa, who introduced me to Swapnendu, and without them, I wouldn't be here today. I also want to thank you all. When I came up with this topic or this title, I thought to myself, who in their right mind would give a talk entitled "Technology is Dead" at a FinTech conference? And then the second thought I had was, who in their right mind would actually attend that talk? And so give yourself a round of applause for having the courage to come here today. So in the US, I don't know if this is true here, in the US there's this term hacking, hackathons, how to sort of shortcut systems. And I'm going to hack my own talk. So I'm going to give you the gist of what I'm about to say over the next 20 minutes in about 15 seconds. And the gist is this. If you want to be successful with any innovation, and particularly any technological innovation, and particularly any fintech innovation, you've got to match the coding of that innovation with the decoding of the human condition. That the big miss in the world today is fundamentally about a misunderstanding of why humans do what they do, why they don't do what they should do, and why they shouldn't do what they do. And that's it. So if that's all you take away from the next 20 minutes, I've done my job. Let me give you the more unabridged version of this. So about, 6 weeks ago, my wife Kate and I were we live in Boston, Massachusetts, and we went out for dinner with friends. And about 20 minutes into the dinner, Kate looks at me across the table and does this, which in America means, the polite version of that is, "Darling, please be quiet." The slightly less polite version is, "Darling, shut the hell up." Whereupon, being immature as I am, I decided to shut the hell up for the entire evening. So for 2 hours, I spoke not a word, which made for an awkward dinner with our friends. We get to the end, on our way home, we're walking home, we live in downtown Boston, and we get into a raging argument on the sidewalk. Now, don't worry, Kate and I love each other very much, but we do argue on occasion. And finally, Kate says to me, honey, I love you, but I have an issue sometimes with your energy. I have an issue sometimes with how much you have to say. And I have an issue with your incessant questioning. And I looked at her and I said, "Darling, I have no issue with your issue with my energy. I have no issue with your issue with my volume of words. The only thing I really have an issue with is you're challenging my questioning." And the reason why I have an issue with that is because I believe, and I believe this in the bottom of my heart, that questioning is the root of all learning. Questioning is the root of all progress, and questioning fundamentally is the root of all successful innovation. And if you buy that, How many people buy that? Do you buy that? Mostly, yeah. Does Socrates buy that? I think Socrates buys that. So hold that up to some stats. So this is the failure rate of startups, definitely in the United States, worldwide. I actually think this is underreported. So my day job, I run the Harvard Innovation Labs. We're an incubator for Harvard student and Harvard alumni ventures. I would say our failure rate is probably more like 95%. Second stat. This is the failure rate of digital transformations. Kind of crazy, right? It's a hot word. I was walking in the hall this morning, and it's everywhere. And 84% of the time, according to sources, 84% of the time, it fails. And then the last stat is corporate innovation. 95% of corporate innovations fail. That's crazy. Think about it. This is the big guns with the big capital and the big brains putting everything they have against the task of innovating their business or their business models, and they fundamentally fail. So here's some other stats. Slightly different kind. 25% of US college students are on some kind of psychotropic medication, meaning medication for anxiety and or depression. 40% of Americans are obese. Turns out 55% of Mexican males are obese, 26% of men in the UK are obese, and all the numbers are going up across the globe. 1 in 4 Americans feel isolated, meaning they have no one to confide in. That's just depressing. And it turns out loneliness, as per this little study done, has the same impact on mortality as does smoking 15 cigarettes a day, which is even more dangerous than obesity. So there's a sort of inference on my part that the consequences that I just shared, those horrifying outcomes, potentially connect to the technology that has become central to our life. It's not a direct one-to-one correlation, but I think most would argue there is some correlation. And so the question is, what's the question? Like, how do we get to the other side of this? How do we get to the other side of where the success rate of innovation, whether it's startups, whether it's transformations, whether it's corporate innovation, significantly improves? And how do we get to a place where those horrifying outcomes aren't actually happening and or start going the other way? And my simple question is this: do we understand humanity really? In my work at Harvard, one of the most favorite questions I get is, Chris, what's the secret to success? How do you innovate successfully? And my answer is, there's no formula, there's no algorithm, there's no path, there's no way. But here's what I know. The majority of startups that I have seen fail over the years make 3 boo-boos. That's a technical term. Boo-boo number 1, they don't understand the problem really. They lock in on a problem which is actually a symptom. And they work on that problem, and ultimately they get to a place where it doesn't actually work because it wasn't really the problem. Boo-boo number 2, the solution they innovate or invent doesn't actually solve the problem that they set out to solve. And then boo-boo number 3, which is the big boo-boo, the mother of all boo-boos, they actually don't understand the customer at all. They think the customer is a stat. They think the customer is a demographic, a psychographic, a function in the case of B2B. They don't actually get that the customer is a human with predilections and biases and neuroses and worries and doubts and fears. They ignore all that because that's messy, that's sloppy, that's complicated. And so ultimately they end up inventing something that actually doesn't meet the customer where the customer is. And really the problem in all that is customers, humans, are complicated. We are complicated. I don't know if this is actually true. You know, the fact of the matter is, yes, we're more erect. Are we more rational? Or is the creature on the far right actually fundamentally more rational than the creature on the left? Maybe not. I'm not 100% sure. And actually, if you look at it through, how many know Maslow? Show of hands, Maslow's hierarchy of need. Okay, so Abraham Maslow was a psychologist in the 1950s who came up with this construct called Maslow's hierarchy of need. And I am a disciple of this guy. I think he nailed why we do what we do, why we don't do what we should do, and why we don't do, or why we do what we shouldn't do. He created this hierarchy that basically says the vast majority of our decisions are filtered through, first, physiological need and need for safety. That our capacity to engage something new is predicated on first feeling safe. At the end of the day, we are still primal animals. We are still in our caves worrying about the woolly mammoth, worrying about the saber-toothed tiger, worrying about the stranger before us because the stranger might hurt us. And as an example of that, I want each of you right now to turn around and introduce yourself to the person right behind you. Come on. Come on. All right. All right. That wasn't that painful, was it? But I'm betting some percentage of you had a hesitance. Some percentage of you had a palpitation in the heart, like, oh my God, I'm now going to have to interact with a stranger. Oh my God. There was fear in your heart, right? Come on, right? The other side of it, in addition to feeling fear, this is the bizarre thing. It goes back to how complicated we are as creatures. On the one hand, we fear strangers. On the other hand, we're desperate for validation from strangers. How weird is that? And here's another stat. 24% of high school students in the United States have engaged in sexting. 1 in 4 students have engaged in sexting. Horrifying. So what do we do about all this? How do we think about this in terms of achieving success with our short-term innovations? So I think about this stuff a lot, and it fundamentally boils down to this statement. The adoption of any innovation requires the benefits to far exceed the costs. And some percentage of you are sitting there going, well, duh, of course. But the truth is, we think of this as a single variate relationship. When I go to Starbucks, I did it this morning. That's also an interesting, I'll come back to that. I did it this morning, and so I gave them money. That's the cost, and they gave me a cup of coffee. That's the benefit, right? Simple value equation. But it's not that simpler. It turns out there are many kinds of costs, and there are many kinds of benefits. We spend money to make money, that's called investing. We spend time to make time, that's called taking a vacation. And my favorite example of the need piece of this thing is I give up the bowl of ice cream I like to eat every night so that I can look good for you when I'm standing on stage. And don't I look good? But the real complexity here it's not one-to-one, it's one-to-many or many-to-many. So as you think about creating an innovation that actually works for the customer you care about, you've got to contemplate this multivariate analysis. You've got to be well aware of the money relationships, the time relationships, and the need relationships. And if you ignore them, it's likely that your innovation will fail. And by the way, this applies as much to B2B as it does B2C, in part because the B2B buyer, I hate to tell you, is a human. They may have a title of procurement officer, they may have a title of CIO or CTO, but at the end of the day, they're human, and they're just as primal and just as fear-based as you and me. And the other rub in all this, and when I presented this slide to a group of MIT engineers once, didn't go well. But I really believe this to be true. All major decisions in life are made emotionally. Where you went to school, why you came to this conference, where you live, the person you married, it's all emotional. Very few algorithms, very few spreadsheets were crafted to make those decisions. And so my sort of mashup of the cost-benefit thing and the Maslow thing is this view that at the end of the day, the buyer of whatever it is you're selling is doing a conscious or subconscious calculation, return on investment, and they're looking at all these factors and the multitude of relationships between them. Some of it's conscious, a lot of it is subconscious. And that makes it that much harder to crack the code. So I gave a talk recently at Harvard. I asked a group of students, what's the value proposition of Uber? And the first answer I got was it gets you from A to B, and then the second answer was it's cheaper than a cab. And then the third answer, which was classic Harvard answer, it eliminates the taxi monopoly. Hilarious. But I actually think the reason why Uber's valued at $130 billion is because of this. It nails the hierarchy of need. It gets you from here to there, that physiological level. It gives you a sense of control. That little icon going that's coming towards you gives you absolute confidence when it's going to get there and gives you absolute confidence of when you're going to get to wherever it is you're trying to get to. I think my view is that is the profound leverage of Uber. It's originally, at least, and I think it's still true, it's for people like me, a sense of belonging, makes me feel better about myself, and then there's a sort of self-actualization thing that enables me to realize my life. You can argue that I'm pushing that, but I think the fundamental 2 or 3 first layers of that are absolutely true. The reason why Uber is a profound technology or a profound business model is because it nails the hierarchy of need. So this is a graveyard, and it's a graveyard of all the innovations that have come before that have failed. Go back to the stats. And my impassioned plea to all of you who are developing things is don't focus on the function, focus on figuring out how to affect adoption of the function. And remember, back to the hierarchy of need, this is fundamentally about changing human behavior. People hate changing their behavior. I talk at Harvard about the most vicious competitor anybody has, any of you have, is the status quo. Because the status quo is comfortable, even if the status quo is not particularly successful. So I've used this word multiple times in the last 5 minutes, adoption, adoption, adoption. And the funny thing about it is nobody's thought much about it. But let's think a little bit more about it. The definition of adoption is to take by choice into a relationship. Like, think about that. Buyers aren't buying, users aren't using, consumers aren't consuming. They're actually adopting whatever it is you're proposing. And adoption is a huge commitment. Huge commitment. Anybody, adoption is a huge commitment. It's such a huge commitment. And the disconnect between that commitment, that level of commitment, and our understanding of who the human really is results in these numbers. And again, I go back to the hack version of this talk. Decode the human, your innovation will be successful. Avoid decoding the human, your innovation will fail. That's the short-term view. And then there's a long-term view, where our disconnect with understanding our humanity, our disconnect with understanding our society, results in unintended consequences of our innovation. So this is the story. I think it was flight 477, Air France, coming out of Rio, 2009, 228 passengers on board, and sadly, it crashed. And the interesting thing is it was the most technologically advanced plane flying at the time. And the more interesting thing is the reason why it crashed is because when the autopilot sensors failed, the pilots actually didn't know how to fly the plane. It's sad. And it sets up, we've got to manage the pace of technological innovation with a recognition of the importance of human innovation. And I spoke at a conference a few weeks ago with Ash Carter, as the Secretary of Defense for Obama, the good old days. I had to sneak that in. By the way, I apologize to the world. I apologize to the world. But Ash said this: the pace of technological change cannot be slowed, but it can and must be steered. Sit with that for a second. We focus on what is before us. We focus on our priorities, our tasks, our jobs, our roles. But there's a bigger responsibility here. We have got to steward this change. We've got to lead this change. We've got to recognize that the context of this change is bigger than our job and bigger than our company and bigger than our little community. That we have a bigger task here. And Ash went on to say, we need to match technological innovation with ethical innovation. And the crazy thing here in the United States, we talk about our values, we talk about our beliefs, we talk about the American way, we talk about the American dream, we talk about stuff, but there's virtually zero effort within the education system to shore any of that up. I got my MBA many years ago. In a 2-year program, I had 2 full marketing courses and one 45-minute lecture on ethics. What's wrong with that? So as a society, a global society, we have all got to come together around the need to shore up the ethical foundation of what we're doing to ensure that the technological innovation serves us well both in the short term and in the long term. Another example of a miss. Anybody see this? This is a Zuckerberg hearings back in, I think it was back in April, before the Senate committee. Both sides failed. The senators, by the way, average age 63, which I get to say because I'm not far away, showed a complete misunderstanding, naivete, I'll even call it stupidity, about what social media is and what it's doing to our country. And on the other side, Mr. Zuckerberg, hope he's not in the audience, basically defended Facebook and did not much to embrace his or their ethical responsibility. And that's a problem. And this is sort of a funny analogy, I guess. But I think this was the first post office in Singapore. And my point here is that when you introduce new technologies into an audience or into a market, you have to think of it holistically. And not just you, the government, you, every participant in that ecosystem, to ensure A, a chance of short-term success, and B, minimize the likelihood of unintended negative consequences. And I just want to have a quick 2 seconds on the underbank, which is a big, I think, big opportunity. You all probably know this within the fintech space, and you're going to hear some exciting news about that later today. The underbank opportunity is the potential to put financial capacity in front of almost 2 billion people that don't have it today. And that is profound. At a humanistic level, that is profound. At an economic level, that is profound. But what must come with it is the push for financial literacy. You cannot give people tools without an understanding of how to use those tools. And so I implore everybody in the space that's working on the underbanked opportunity to recognize that literacy is a major piece of the equation. So we end up in this place derived from technology. And by the way, I think some people are like, "Are you against technology?" I'm totally for technology. I'm just for calculated, ethically based technology. We end up in this place where intellectually we're learning, we're not able to do the things that we should be able to do. By the way, the lexicon of the average American has gone from 15,000 words to 5,000 words in the last 30 years. Physically, our form of play now is sitting on a sofa watching a screen. Emotionally, we're struggling with intimacy. Economically, more and more of us, I think, are struggling to create real value. And then spiritually, there's this huge movement in the United States to try to find community out of it all. There's a loneliness that is pervasive across our society. I mentioned movement. The good news is there is a movement. There's a whole Silicon Valley thing happening right now where a lot of the tech leaders are banding together to look at how they're raising their kids, the nature of education, the role of mobile devices in that education. Interesting book by this guy John Havens called Artificial Intelligence and the Importance of Bringing the Human Equation into the potential of AI. Tim Cook spoke several weeks ago to the European Union at a data privacy conference. If you haven't watched his talk, I highly recommend it. But the gist of his talk is not dissimilar from the gist of my talk, which is we have a responsibility to manage technology so that it is a democratization engine, it is a freedom fighter, and that is applied for the good and avoids the not so good. He talked about the importance of all of us building a foundation of trust. And I say all of us because, again, this isn't a government thing, this isn't a corporate thing, this isn't an educator thing, it's an everybody thing. We've got to step forward and build this foundation. And then he presented these 4 human rights, which make perfect sense. The challenge is, go back to the Senate hearing with Zuckerberg, there's no movement in the United States right now to lock on anything like this. And then the last thing he said, which I absolutely love, is this. Our responsibility, not the tech innovators, not everybody's responsibility, is to infuse the technologies we make with the humanity that makes us. That's simple. I'm not sure I need to say this, but I'm going to say it anyway. So there's this book written by this guy named John Glubb back in the 1920s, kind of a wacky guy. He studied empires for much of his career, and he created this construct that every empire rises and falls. Every one, from the Mongol Empire to the British Empire, lasted about 250 years. They start at the age of pioneers, then they conquer, and then they stabilize, and then they affect affluence, and then all of a sudden, when they get into the age of intellect, they start disconnecting from their humanity. Their innovations start disconnecting from their humanity, and that is the beginning of the end. This applies to empires, it applies to countries, it applies to companies, and I actually think it applies to startups. It's just a really wonderful reminder that this connection to humanity really is everything. It's everything in every aspect of our life. Every innovation, every interaction, every experience is made better when you look at it through the eyes of the other person. This applies to companies. It also applies to significant others. I'm convinced that the divorce rate in the United States is a function of people simply not doing this. So, the last question of questions is not a question. It's a request. If you're an educator, help us bring ethics into the equation. If you're a company, don't look simply at creating value for your customer, look at creating value for mankind. If you're a startup, stop working on the solution and take a step back and consider, do you understand the human really? And if you're a general consumer, just step forward and say, this stuff matters to you and it matters to future generations. So the whole idea of technology is dead is my way of saying it is but an inanimate thing. The value of it lies in its capacity to be connected to the human truth and the human condition. Thanks very much.